Hey, what's up? Today we're going to explore a really exciting topic. Through all of your academic career, you've been studying biology, at least in some part, every year in science class. But now you finally get to look at the foundation of biology. What makes all of biology make sense? Charles Darwin is widely considered the father of biology because of his contributions to the theory of evolution. He went on a really intense journey all the way around the Atlantic Ocean, down around South America and Africa, and on a ship called the Beagle, in these wildly exotic places. To Darwin, he was from Britain. These very exotic places offered him some insights that he just wasn't expecting. He was looking at the fossil records and the different types of critters and plants that lived on all of these different islands that they were coming across, and he noticed similarities. He started noticing that there was similar organisms on places that were similar. So islands in Africa and islands in South America, if they had similar climates, if they had similar environments, is a better word, he noticed that the organisms were adapted to living there. He eventually worked out what he calls the theory of natural selection, meaning that the environment will naturally select the characteristics of the organisms that are living in that environment. That sounds simple, and yet, man, does it bring so many possibilities. That's what makes a perfectly awesome scientific theory, when it's stated so simply and yet is so powerful. It has so many implications. Think of all the environments. Think of all the small details. No wonder we have 8.74 million different species. So let's look at a real-life example of natural selection. This really powerful theory. So the Industrial Revolution in Britain began in about the 1760s, about 250 years ago. The Industrial Revolution, in short, was the birth of manufacturing and factories. So concentrating people into small places, getting them all to do a small task, and together they would produce the same product over and over and over and over again. This made a lot of money. This was a really successful strategy. Obviously, we still use the factory system today. But with all that production, they weren't really aware of the amount of pollution that they were making. Back when the factory system first started, they really weren't expecting the pollution to be so intense. So really rapidly, the landscape in London started to change. The majority of trees in Britain are white. They have a lighter colored bark. There used to be lots of white lichen, but with all the pollution, that all started to darken. All the trees started getting a little bit darker. All the lichen started getting covered in soot and ash, and that left the organisms there a little exposed. One species in particular, the peppered moth, was a very light colored moth, and it had little black specks on it. It was almost perfectly suited to blend in with the lighter colored bark and the lighter colored lichen that covered much of the ground there. Their camouflage was great. And then when all of the environment that they lived in started getting darker, suddenly they were very in danger to predators. Imagine a bird of prey looking at a scenery. If the moth is camouflaged into the background, it's hard for that bird to see it. But the second you've got a white-colored moth on black ground, that is an open target for that bird. So naturally, the lighter colored moths started getting picked off really fast. Their populations started to decline. But not all moths, just like us, we all look different. The moths were a little different too. The moths that were darker, the ones that had a little bit more of the black speckling, were more likely to not be seen by the birds. So they were more likely to survive. So that small difference between being mostly white or mostly dark was the difference maker in who got to live and who got eaten. So the genes that those darker colored moths had, they were darker colored. That was part of their genetics. So when they made babies, their babies also got that darker colored gene. All of those babies were more likely to survive. So if they were more likely to survive, they were more likely to go make their own babies who also have the dark colored gene. That kind of an advantage is what natural selection is all about. Any organism that has an advantage over another organism, no matter what that advantage is, in whether it's a behavior, whether it's the physical appearance, if you have an advantage, you are more likely to survive, and therefore you're more likely to make babies. Given that you're statistically more likely to make babies, you're going to have a larger batch of kids in the new population. The new population is going to make even more babies with that advantage. Before long, that advantage spreads through the whole population until all or nearly all of the species in the area have that exact same advantage. That's what natural selection is all about. The environment has such a huge role to play in how each of the species will adapt, how the environment decides kind of who gets to live and who gets to die. Those that are best adapted to survival are going to be the ones that get to survive, get to make babies. So, natural selection, in summary, is the environment deciding who lives and who dies, who gets to make babies, who doesn't. Those with the greatest number of advantages are going to be the ones most likely to make those babies. The example of the peppered moth is nowhere near to actual reality, though. There's so many factors that come into play. There's so much more than just, is there pollution on the ground or not? Environments have so much more than that. Water content, temperature, what organisms are there? Are they trying to eat the same food as you? Are they trying to eat you? There's so many things that are involved in every single ecosystem that it's very rare that you can just look at one single thing and be like, oh, that's what's causing them to change. In that one case, it's such a classic example because it really was the pollution, and it was as simple as that. But let's think of something a little bit more closer to home. Let's think about rabbits, just in the forest. Speed isn't the only thing that determines whether they live or die. If that was true, we would have extraordinarily fast rabbits. The fastest rabbits would always be the ones that get to make babies. So you would have this continual trend of faster and faster and faster rabbits. And coincidentally, the things that hunt them, the lynx and coyotes, they would also be faster and faster and faster to catch their prey. But it can't just come down to speed. That's not the only factor. Let's just introduce one other factor and see how much more complicated this gets. Food. The rabbits, for them to run, have to spend very precious energy. You can't make babies if you don't have any energy to do so. So, if they're faster and faster and faster, they're spending more and more and more energy. eventually there needs to be a trade-off. It's all about balance. Eventually, the extra speed is too much of a cost for the rabbit, and eventually it just makes more sense to actually be kind of capped off at a certain speed. That level is actually kind of determined by their environment. Remember, there's things chasing them. So rabbits only need to be so fast to, most of the time, get away from predators. Environments never stay the same, though. They're constantly changing. We live on a very dynamic Earth, with different places changing all the time. Humans, we can change things really fast. We are currently going through what's called an anthropogenic climate change, meaning humans are changing the climate. Let's think about rabbits. In the wintertime, their fur is white. In the springtime, they shed their white fur and they grow in some brown fur. So climate change has an impact on them. If the snow is melting even a couple days earlier, even a week earlier than they're used to, then when their fur naturally sheds off, that white fur naturally sheds off, if they are shedding off their white fur later than when the climate is, or when their genes are telling them to, they're left exposed. They're left as this white beacon in the middle of a very brown environment, leaving them open to higher amounts of predation. So again, natural selection will start playing on that. The rabbits that shed their fur a little bit earlier are going to be more likely to survive. That would be an advantage for them. So changing environments change the organisms. They must adapt. And again, that's what natural selection is all about. Those organisms with an advantage will be the most adapted for their environment, and they're going to be the ones that are most likely to succeed. In short, natural selection can be summed up in 5 statements called the 5 principles of natural selection. 1. All organisms have genetic variations, and those genetic variations are inheritable. They can be passed on to offspring. 2. When it comes to reproduction, more organisms are produced than can possibly survive in their environment. 3. This makes those organisms all compete with each other. If there are hundreds of more rabbits than can possibly survive in that small patch of forest, they are going to be fighting over the same resources, the same food, the same mates, the same water, all of the things that they need to survive. So those best equipped to get those resources have a survival advantage. Survival advantages spread through the population because those animals with the survival advantage are going to be more likely to make babies. This is the selection part of the theory. 5. These changes accumulate over time. As a species, adapts continually to a constantly changing environment, their population is going to continuously shift. They're going to completely become something different. Eventually, when they're so different from the previous populations, they eventually get called a new species. That is called speciation. Here's a handy picture I saw in Sketchplanations that might help you visualize the process, especially if you're a more visual learner. But wait, there's more. Humans, we're a treat. We have the power to decide. We can literally go and choose which organisms get to mate. Which male mates with which female. We can be the selector. That is called artificial selection. In agriculture, You want to make the biggest, tastiest, fastest growing product that you can. A farmer would want 4 different harvests than just one. When they're deciding which plants get to mate with which, they, for example, will look at an apple. They're like, okay, this tree is producing really sweet apples. Awesome. I want all my trees to produce sweet apples. So they find another tree that is also producing apples that it likes. And then it literally just mates them. It takes the pollen from one tree and mates it with the flower of the second tree, and bam, you've got seeds. Think of how fast we can change a species by implementing artificial selection. We are doing all of the deciding. Take, for example, a dog breeder that wants to make a smaller dog. All of those little tiny miniatures that have really only come into existence recently. It really just is a matter of taking a litter of puppies. Look at them all. Which ones are smallest? Okay, look at another litter of puppies. Which one is smallest? Take those two and breed them together. The genes of the new offspring are naturally going to be a little bit smaller. So, and you keep doing that process. You keep just breeding the smallest ones and the smallest ones and the smallest ones, and before you know it, you've got little miniature pinchers. A pug and a bulldog, they're just simply a product of somebody who decided that short noses, short snouts were more optimal, so they kept breeding the dogs with the shortest and shortest snouts, and eventually you get these like face pressed in dog things. Get this, every single dog is a wolf. Every single one that we have. We started breeding wolves and we started artificially selecting for different traits that we wanted. Want a tamer dog? Breed the tamest wolves. You want a dog with a dog that's smaller? Maybe a wolf is too big, a little bit too scary. Start breeding the smallest ones. Before long, we've bred wolves to be so many different shapes and sizes and colors and anything we desire. Look at this chicken from 1957. Look at this one in 2005. We bred for that. Look at this pretty flower. It's actually broccoli and cauliflower and kale and Brussels sprouts and cabbage. We bred for it. Let's wrap up. We've talked about 2 really important things. One being natural selection. Natural selection is when the environment decides which organisms get to live and which die based on inherited advantages. Artificial selection is when we decide what gets to breed, what gets to make the babies, based on things that we want. That's all for this one. I know it's a little bit of a long one, but it's a pretty fundamental one to all of biology. So hopefully you bared with me and stuck it through the whole thing. And see you next time.